Hi, everybody. My name is Heather Dune Macadam, and I am a writer and a filmmaker. I've written 3 books about the first transports of women to Auschwitz, and the one we're going to talk about today is Star-Crossed, a true Romeo and Juliet story in Hitler's Paris. It's sort of an interesting story because one of those women was one of my best friend's aunt. And her mother, Michelle Kers, is the woman who I interviewed and worked with in Paris in 2020, right after the COVID crisis, and spent a load of time in Paris doing research in archives and working in Michelle's archive. She inherited letters and art that was done by her sister, Annette. And her sister was a young artist at the Beaux-Arts. She was a surrealist and a very, very interesting young woman. She was 19. She turns 20 in 1941. And the letters that we have give us an insight into what it was like to be a young woman, a teenager, under the occupation in Paris. So I'm going to discuss, first of all, the family. What we have here is a very interesting family. They came out of Poland, and Maurice, who was Moshe in Poland, but he changed his name to Maurice when he came to France. He was definitely a Francophile. He was a tailor, and he brought his wife, Kayla, to Nancy, which is very close to the border of Germany. And they opened up a shop in the market, a market stall, and sold clothes, made clothes for people. And then they ended up with a real shop, and it was called Zelman's Tailors, and they had 5 children. There was Guy, who was the oldest. Annette was the second oldest. Then there was Charles in the middle, and then Camille and Michelle, who's my friend Laurence's mother. So the family was very, they were known as the Zelman Circus. They were crazy. Maurice was very flamboyant. He sang, he danced, they had a piano in the dining room, so every night was musical theater. And it's a really wonderful, close family, a very, very active, very artistic. And then the Germans invade. So the first thing that happens is the family has to flee with everybody from Nancy, and they head down south, and they end up very near Bordeaux in Lalande, and they are there for a while. Then they go into Bordeaux because they feel safer in the city, and then Maurice's sister says there's an apartment in Paris, so they go up to Paris, and they are in a very close-knit Jewish community. Maurice is, Michelle used to joke, Maurice clothed half of Paris. And that may be why there was always a chicken on the table. Michelle does not remember being hungry, although her parents, I'm sure, were. And she was 10, 11 years old, quite young. So they protected her quite a bit, of course, from what was going on. And she has a real wonderful sense of how they survived as a family. The Zelman family in Paris, there was always somebody sleeping under the table. There was lots of refugees coming in and out of the apartment. And when they arrive in Paris, Annette decides that she's going to be an artist. She's never drawn anything before. So she goes to the Beaux-Arts, and she has to do a drawing test. And she draws the discus thrower. Now, she's never drawn anything, and she makes her discus thrower anatomically correct because she's an artist, and she gets in. And she's so excited that she runs home and she holds up this wonderful drawing that she's done of the discus thrower. And her aunt immediately like jumps and closes her cousin's eyes so she doesn't see a man who's naked. And Annette's family bursts out laughing. They think it's hilarious that this sister is so shy. And that's sort of, that's sort of like the Zelmans. That is their circus. The letters that Annette writes are really funny and give you a real sense of the community they lived in, kids coming in and out of the house, roller skating up and down the hallways. We actually went into the building where she lived in Paris, on Boulevard Strasbourg, and you could see the marble steps were worn, and I could just hear kids, running up and down the stairs so much. Back to Annette. At the Beaux-Arts, just down the street, just 2 blocks, is this cafe, and it's called the Café de Flore. And there is something wonderful at the Café de Flore. Besides being très, très chic, there is a stove, and it's warm. And you can get a cup of coffee, and you can sit there all day, and they won't throw you out. So who hangs out at the Café de Flore? Well, just about everybody. And one of the people that Annette meets, there's sort of tables. So there's a table of young men who are from the Sorbonne. They study philosophy. They're surrealists. They're very handsome. They're worldly. They're a little older than she is, and she's very attracted to one of them. And his name is Jean Rouche. Now, if you know who Jean Rouche is, he ends up inventing or just, cinema verite. And he becomes a documentary filmmaker. And one of Annette's best friends is Yannick Bellon, who also becomes a filmmaker in the post-war era. And they are, Annette and Jean Rouche fall madly in love. Well, I should say Jean Rouche falls madly in love. Annette's not so sure of him. And he gets tired of waiting. And he ends up with Yannick Bellon, as you can see in that photograph. And Yannick is young. She's I think she's 16. But Annette is 19, and, it's the war. So these are actually these lovely photographs that you'll see here of Jean Rouche and Yannick Bellon later in life, when they had really built their names for themselves. Other people at the Café de Flore: Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, sat in the corner. Michelle remembers meeting them when she was a child, going to pick Annette up and going up to the table and saying, "Annette, it's time to come home for dinner." Also, Jacques Prévert was there. Simone Signoret is the same age as Annette and shows up at the Café de Flore about the same time. So there's a table of actors. There's a table of surrealists. There's also a table of lesbians. Sonia Mosé is one of those lesbians. And she's a beautiful, beautiful model. She's also a surrealist artist, and she is a model for Man Ray. She has a tragic end because she is Jewish. And, but she, is one of the few women in the 1932 Surrealist exhibition. They did all these mannequins, Dali, Man Ray, and Sonia Mosé did this wonderful, nude mannequin, and she puts a cockroach on the mouth of the woman, who is basically her. So this is a really eclectic group of people. They are highly intelligent. They're very involved in the arts. They're really interesting. And Annette feels like she has, just discovered life. One of her best friends is Bella Lempert, and Bella is in love with Claude Croutel. The two girls are very, very good friends with Jean Rouche. They make him shirts, and he's going to Africa. They make shirts for him with pockets on them, and it's really fascinating. But they also end up falling out because they're both attracted to Claude Croutel. Bella ends up with him, and Annette ends up falling in love with his best friend, whose name is Jean Jausion. So Jean Jausion was a very interesting young man. He was a surrealist. He was into Dada art. He was a poet. He wanted to be a writer. And he also came from a very, very upper class family, well educated. His father was a doctor. He was also a collaborator. But Jean Jausion finds sort of a sense of home and family in Annette's family. And while there are issues with the fact that he's a Gentile and she's a Jew, eventually the Zelman family ends up adopting Jean into their lives and loving him like a son and a brother. Jean Jausion is part of a group called Les Reverbères, which is the street lamps, and it started in the 30s. It is they did a number of really interesting zines. There's one that's like the size of a bookmark, and they have images in them. They are experimental art, experimental writing, and just challenge using surrealism as a way of expressing themselves. And Georges Huguenet is one of Jean Jausion's best friends. Huguenet has a printing press, so he is able to do a lot of the printing that they do for Les Reverbères. He's a member of Les Reverbères. And after the invasion, we have a really interesting moment with a woman whose name is Jean Jausion. She was, in fact, German, and she runs an art gallery. And so the Germans, they call it degenerate art, right? So all surrealist modern art is considered degenerate art. Jean is very good at swanning up to the Nazis, and she has a gallery of one exhibition that's acceptable, and the back room is surrealism. So you can go through the door and see surrealist art. She also has people who are hiding from the Nazis upstairs. She and Georges Huguenet are running they're doing IDs on his printing press. They're forging papers for people so they can escape, so they can survive. And they print this really amazing booklet called Non-Voileur, and it is Picasso does the prints for it, and Georges Huguenet writes the poetry for it. And the way surrealism worked under the occupation was that the Germans couldn't understand what they were saying. So they were able to send messages to the resistance through their art and through their poetry. It's really fascinating. I never knew this, and I just was really, really interested in that. The things that you can do in occupied Paris, very, very little. Everything is rationed. So you can only get so much fabric. You're only allowed one hat a year. There's no dancing. There is just, the Nazis tighten up everything culturally, and then they're going to go for the Jews. But Parisians are very inventive, right? So there are a number of ways that they rebel. One of my favorites is that they create dance classes, they call it a dance class. Everybody shows up and they dance until they get shut down. And they call them birthday parties. And Annette writes, I'm going to a birthday party tonight. And so that's one of the ways they are able to dance. They also are very into zazus. And if you've heard about the zazus, they were considered extremely degenerate because it was a style of American clothing. And with the clothing rations, zazus wore lots and lots of pleats in your skirts and dresses. Everything had lots of fabric on it. That was not okay. The girls would also make hats out of paper, and they would, make them very, very flamboyant and wear them down the street. And Zazu was pretty much inspired by Cab Calloway, Zazu Zabi, and jazz, American jazz. So Django Reinhardt was a big part of the movement. He was always playing at the birthday parties where people were dancing. And it was, how do you survive culturally? How do you keep your culture alive under with an occupied force, clamping down on everything? So, Annette and Jean Jausion fall madly in love, and one night, Bella Lempert, who is in love with Claude Courtel, is dragged out of her bed and arrested. And she's Jewish, but they say that she's a foreign national and a communist. And she's thrown into prison. And Claude is beside himself. And so is Jean and Annette and Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. Nobody can figure out what's going on. So, what we don't know for sure, we believe that Jean Jausion and Annette decide that the best way to protect her is to get married so that she can change her name from Zelman to Jausion. And since his father is a very famous doctor who's friends of Cocteau's and all the other collaborators, this will help protect her. So they file their marriage ban, and she's arrested. One night, she's alone. By this point, the family has fled Paris, and they have headed to Limoges. Annette says, I'm going to close up the apartment, and I will see you there. I'll come to Limoges. And she's lying. She moves in with Jean Jausion. And they file their marriage bans. And she's over at the apartment of her parents, packing up when the police come. And they arrest her. And she is taken to the depot, which is the Palais de Justice. It's an enormous, enormous place in Paris. It's like 1 block long. And the women are put into the prison there, which is in the basement. And there she meets a number of young women. From the depot, where she is for a couple of weeks, she's then taken to another prison called Les Tourelles, where more women are. And to, condense the story very quickly, they are 66 of those women that she's befriended are put on the first transport of French women to Auschwitz. They are with 1,000 French men. This is the third transport to Auschwitz of French men and the first of French women, and it is June 22nd, 1942. When they arrive in Auschwitz, they see a bunch of skinny young men in Russian uniforms, and they can't figure out, they only speak Slovak. They're incredibly skinny, and they refer to them as the scarecrows. And these scarecrows come running up to them, and they realize they're girls. And they say to them in Slovak and German, they don't speak French, does the world know about us? Does the world know about us? And the French women who speak Slovak and German look at them and say, no, and realize that now the world does not know about the French women either. So those girls are from the first 4 transports of Jews from Slovakia. And they have been in Auschwitz since March 1942. Of the girls, of the 66 girls that arrive in Auschwitz, we have Sarah Tismeka, They also called her Bubi, who was she was a teenager. I think she was like 17 years old. Rhea Kagan, who was one of the few women who will survive. Alice Henny, or Couscous. She was an Algerian Jew. She was arrested for making a phone call, and she ends up in prison in her evening gown. Elise Mella was arrested with her mother. They were walking down the street to pick up their yellow stars, and they didn't have them on yet, so they were both thrown into prison. Elise and her mother will die in Auschwitz on September 15th, 1942. Tamara Iserly is arrested for getting into the wrong metro car. Jews have to be in the last metro car in Paris. She doesn't get into the last metro car. She's a medical student at the Sorbonne. She ends up working in the hospital in Auschwitz, and she dies of typhus. Ida Levine is a very close friend of Annette's. She encourages the women to do calisthenics every day when they're in prison in the depot in Les Tourelles, so they keep their physical strength. Alice Henny, Couscous, teaches them belly dancing. They do languages. They really form a community in the depot in Les Tourelles to keep their minds and their bodies active and not being depressed. And then they get to Auschwitz. And then we also have Saipa Glusman was 21. Of the 66 women that arrive on that transport, only 2 will survive. And the last time Annette was seen is by Rhea Kagan. So they arrive in Auschwitz, and what people often think is that Birkenau is Auschwitz, right? Well, it's not. Auschwitz I was originally the Polish army barracks, and the women's camp is divided inside of the men's camp. There's 10 blocks. They have a fence around them. And when the French women arrived, there are so many women already there that they have built Nissan huts in between the blocks. And that's where the French women go. We are now in June. By July, there are transports coming, more transports from France, but they're also coming in from Belgium. In August, they start coming in from Holland. They're coming in from Poland. And very, very quickly, the women's camp is overcrowded. One of the survivors says that you had to step over people. Everybody was on the ground, sleeping on the ground even. Block 10 was where the first transport of women arrive. And the other thing that you probably don't know is that when you think of prison uniforms, you think of those striped outfits. Well, that's not what they wore. The first women in Auschwitz in 1942 were dressed in Russian men's soldiers' uniforms, Russian soldiers' uniforms, and they were huge. Right? These girls are they're 5 foot, they're 5'2", they're tiny. And they don't have any belts. They take all their underwear away. The uniforms are bloody. They're full of holes and lice. They're disgusting. Really, really gross. And the work that they have to do is absolutely brutal. They have to demolish houses. They have to make bricks. They have to dig clay and make bricks. And these are young women, right? The footage that we have from a film called Ostadi Atop, and it was filmed in 1946-47 in Auschwitz by a Polish prisoner who did a film that was called The Last Stage, and it is pretty much it's a docudrama. We don't have any other footage except from liberation by the Russians of Auschwitz. And the director used actual prisoners who wore their own uniforms as her extras. And they reenacted the work that they had to do so that we could see actually what these young women had to do. It's quite extraordinary to have that as a document so that we can see it. And I have used that in my research and in my film work. So Annette disappears. Jean Jausion doesn't have any idea where she is. All he knows is that she's headed east, and that's 1942. In 1945, when Paris is finally liberated by Patton's army, Jean Jausion, who's still madly in love with his fiancée, gets a job with Frank Tireur to report on the Patton's army going across France and liberating Europe, and he follows in their tracks, and he is in a car, and he ends up in an area called Gravelotte, and there we do not know what happens except that his body is found, which is why we call this Romeo and Juliet in Hitler's Paris. So when I went to Gravelotte with my writing partner, Simone, we found the farm where Jean Jausion's body was discovered, and we found tank shells with serial numbers and of American tank shells, and there was a canteen there. It's a very, very vast space. Gravelotte has seen a lot of wars, and it's like the pawn in the chess move because it protects Metz. And Hitler had said, do not lose Metz at all costs. You must hold Metz. So the German army is trying to hold on to Metz against Patton. And that does actually slow the progress of Patton's crossing Europe. Jean Jausion is part of the Resistant Fighters Memorial in Paris. He was missing for a long time. Nobody knows what happened to Annette concretely. But Rhea Kagan, who was one of the survivors, does give us those last moments with the last time she sees Annette, and she brings water to her and her friends, Sonia Gottman and Ida Levine. And Annette says to her, merci. And that's the last time Rhea sees her. And that's in August 1942. Bella Lempert dies in September 1942 in the gas. We know that Elise Mela is gassed on September 15th. And we do not have a concrete death date for Annette. Her family found out much later who denounced her to the SS, to the Nazis in Paris, so that she would be arrested, and you can find out all of that story in Star-Crossed. Claudette Bloch Kennedy is the other survivor. Both Rhea Kagan and Claudette have written accounts of their stories in Auschwitz. And Claudette survives because she's a scientist and she does research on how to improve rubber. And Rhea Kagan was able to survive because she spoke so many languages, and she became a secretary for the SS and wrote down the death numbers of how many people were dying. And she ends up testifying against Eichmann in 1961. So that's, in a nutshell, the story of Annette Zelman and Jean Jausion, the occupation of Paris from a teenager's point of view. And I am thrilled to open it up for questions now, if anybody has any.
Hi, Heather. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. It's wonderful to see such a lovely group of people. Thank you.
Yeah, we're the best. We're awesome. We rock. You will not find a better, more appreciative audience anywhere that would read your book. It was a wonderful book, and I hope you don't mind. I posted an image there. Can you see the image that
I can, yeah. That's Heydrich, right?
Yeah, but you see the guy to Heydrich's right, not the tubby guy, the rather handsome guy to Heydrich's right. That's Helmut Nocken. And bear with me here. We'll have lots of questions for you, but I did write a book about the occupation of Paris, 1,500 Days of Increasing Terror,
Mm.
called Avenue of Spies. And I posted that photograph because I want you to react to this little story. This is a 36-year-old guy that becomes head of the Gestapo in Paris and then all of France. At least 125,000 French civilians, Jewish and otherwise, were deported under his direct command. Almost all of them were deported by the French themselves. The Grand Raffle in July of 1942, over 10,000 Parisians sent mainly to Auschwitz by French policemen who had a lunch break between separating hysterical mothers from their children. Nocken was arrested by the Americans at the end of the war, put on trial by the French and the Americans, served 10 years, and then ended his life in the late 90s as a wealthy insurance salesman, and said that he knew about the deportations. He organized them, of course, but he didn't know where people were being sent to.
Right.
Hurt people tend to hurt other people. And if we look at what's happening in the Middle East right now, do you think that there is a residual rage among Jewish people at how they were victims of an immense, extremely well organized genocide, how few people helped them, how most people in France either stood aside or, in fact, collaborated? Um, what are your thoughts about how we now can see these tragic love stories, this one and others, and the tragedy of the Jewish people in World War II? How does that play out today?
Oh, that's complicated, and I wouldn't touch on the psychology of victims and victimizers. It's so complicated. But it is one of the things that I continually find shocking is the lack of responsibility, culpability, and punishment that so many of the SS were convicted. They're convicted, and certainly we cover that in Star-Crossed. Some of our bad players, they it is the French are often re-educated and then released back into the community, especially if they come from wealthy families. It's Jean Cocteau was a collaborator, and he was very good friends with Jean Jausion's father, Hubert Jausion, Dr. Hubert Jausion. I'm always sort of shocked to see that Cocteau, he's a celebrated filmmaker. I've watched his films, but I certainly didn't know about his collaboration until I began on this journey. And I find that sort of extraordinary that people's lives were not, destroyed, that they weren't held accountable. And as we see in so many cultures, that turning that blind eye to horror is, and I think we're seeing it today. It's not okay to be vocal against that abuse, and you will be punished for it. And I think that was very, very true in France. And if you are going to stand up and say, stand up for your fellow, um, your neighbors who are Jewish and say, this is wrong, or stand up for the Zazu youth and say this is wrong, you're going to end up in a concentration camp or murdered. And that was standard practice. And unfortunately, I'm a teacher, and I'm always encouraging my students to stand up, think for yourself, stand up for justice, stand up for the victim. But that may mean that you are victimized to do that, and that we certainly do see that over and over again in these stories. I think that's one of the reasons why so many people are drawn to these stories. I certainly was as a young person. I was drawn to the heroic acts of young people in World War II, and hope that I would be one of those people to stand up and defend my Jewish friends.
What kind of emotional toll has writing about the Holocaust taken on you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It was harder when I was younger. The My work, I just finished this film 999 The Forgotten Girls, which is based on my book 999, and the first transport to Auschwitz. And at this point, it just feels like a mission, and I'm very good at separating my ego from the work. It's work that needs to be done. Nobody's really focused on 1942 women in Auschwitz. And nobody's asked the question, why were girls targeted first? The first transport was 999, mostly teenage girls. And Annette is, she's 21 when she goes to Auschwitz. And that, I feel that that's extremely important, especially in today's culture as well. We see young women being marginalized in Afghanistan, obviously, the Yazidis, the Kurds, Boko Haram. Young women are always targets of war. Always. We saw it on October 7th. We see it in Gaza. If you want to destroy a race of people, you destroy women and children. That's what you get rid of. And because men will fight and duke it out, right? You get rid of those who won't duke it out. And that is the cruel reality of human beings, not humanity, obviously. And I think that it is up to us to have a higher consciousness and to not revert to those base primal instincts that brought us out of the trees and into communities. And I think that that's the work that needs to be done, that we have way more similarities than we do differences. And so that's the focus. It doesn't mean I don't cry or, occasionally drink too much, but I feel very dedicated to these young women. And we have, from the first transport, there are 2 women left. One just turned 100, and the other is in her, obviously, 98, 99. So, I have to be their voice because they can't speak anymore. And Michelle, I just saw her in Paris this summer, and she's 96, and she's an extraordinary spirit. I just adore her. And it's a mission.
Well, it's a very important mission, and you do it very, very well. What would these very few final survivors, what would they want young people around the world, and in particular in the United States, to know about their life stories? What are the morals that they would really want young people to understand?
Well, our film ends with a statement by Edith Grossman. Edith is up here. That's her. And she she literally says, please, 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 you do not have a winner in a war. War, it destroys houses, economy, families, um, spiritual being, psychological being. Nobody wins. There are no winners in a war. So why are we still having them? It's like, and you can't allow a few crazy people to destroy what is, we have a couple of megalomaniacs in the world today that are destroying peace. And obviously they have their thugs underneath them that are helping. But it's just that is the message. It's the message of my work. It's the message of my film. It's the message of my survivors. Rena, who was the subject of my very first book, Rena's Promise, very famously says, I do not hate. To hate is to let Hitler win. That's a big charge for us. Like, I wasn't victimized by Hitler. Rena was. And if she can say that, then, I need to also step up and be able to not hate, and to be able to help people recover a sense of love and appreciation for each other, whether or not you agree with them or not.
Doesn't any culture need to be extremely vigilant, especially when it comes to young people, in terms of making sure that they understand how racism develops, how the dehumanization of others can develop? Don't we need to be just constantly vigilant and do a lot more to educate people, not just about racism, but about dehumanization of others?
We do, but I have to say, I am of the ilk that we do that not by beating kids over the head with the horror, but we do that by giving them tools so that they can act differently. Because, it's reactive mode. If I'm hurt, I strike. And how do I not become reactive? How does that work? And I think that that's really important, that we give young people those tools. And it's certainly what I try to speak about in communities and in my work in with teenagers, that first of all, teenagers are great. They're amazing. And they have, they still have that innocence and that energy to make things happen. And it doesn't mean that they're can't be very difficult and hormonal and drive us all nuts because we're older. But young people have tremendous energy to create change, and they believe that they can do it. And so I think our job is to encourage them to do it and to give them the power to do it. So my niece, just as a quick example, my niece is Danish. And when she was in middle school and high school, she sat on the Department of Education in Denmark. So the Department of Education in Denmark has grammar school age children, middle school age children, and high school age children conferring with the government on education, what to be taught and how education should come into the community, right? She's now part of the government in the UK, and I think she's going to Mongolia. I mean, she's like going to be an ambassador. I mean, she's just incredibly active and involved in politics since she was in a young age. but why are adults making decisions for young people? Why aren't our young people involved in our government in America? I think it's just brilliant that they had young people involved in the Department of Education, and so that we can learn what they want to know and we can help support that rather than having government officials who are biased and want to ban books or whatever, telling young people how to think. And I don't think that's helpful.
So, what were the things during your research and writing in the book that filled you full of joy and hope? What were the positives that you can take away from what ends up being a very dark story, you know?
Yeah, well, it's a family. This is an incredible family, and that they only lost one daughter, one child is pretty amazing. Michelle's mother lost, I think, 12 people in the family. And that was actually because they were in Bordeaux and they were shuffled off into a camp that ended up, one of the early camps. But it is extraordinary how the family came together and helped each other, and I come from a more modern family where we're much more separated and all over the place, and I just gained so much from the Zelman family and also the Cares family, which is one of my best friends. There is a great spirit in that family. And Michelle said something very, very interesting when we were working on, at one point, the family's fleeing Paris. And the first thing that happened, it's a very, very funny story, that the apartment in Paris, it's an open door policy. Kids, the door is constantly banging. Everybody's coming in and out. And there's a knock on the door one night. And as soon as somebody knocks, Kayla knows this is not a friend or a family, right? So she goes and answers the door, and the gendarme are there, and they want to know where Maurice is. And she begins screaming at them that, that man left me with all these kids, and, if he's with his mistress, and if you see him, you tell him, right? And she goes off, and it's very, very, quick, smart. And the police are like, whoa, like an angry French woman. They back off, they leave. And Maurice shows up a couple of hours later, and she says, you have to leave now. So he and Charles, the middle son, literally pack up and go. And I said to Michelle, what did you kiss? Like, what was it like? Were you crying? Were you upset? And she said, no, we're Jews. We said, bye, Papa. And a bientôt, see you later. There was no emotion. There was no, this maudlin, I would have written it at this very dramatic moment, right? No, it was like, get out now. And that, it was very matter of fact. And that is really fascinating to me. Like, this is not the only time that they had to flee. And it was, you act fast, you do it, and you don't make a big deal about it. And yeah, so I learned a lot from her about that. Yeah.
What do you think explains why some people in that terrible situation chose to risk everything, and those who didn't? Because, the vast majority of people in an occupied country, certainly in World War II, exist in a gray area, a gray zone where they don't collaborate, they don't want to collaborate, but they also don't resist. They just try and keep their heads down and hope that it all ends one day. but a very small minority, and it is a very small minority, perhaps less than 1% of the French population actually did actively resist. What explains that 1%, that this beautiful, very small minority? What is it that makes them put everything on the line?
That's a good question. I don't know. Um, is it a sense of moral and ethics, morality and ethics? Is it a sense of danger? Like, oh, this will be exciting. Um, is it, I think I was very interested in how the artist resisted. And we have lots of instances of that in the book. Cafe de Flore, the owner of Cafe de Flore, was constantly hiding people. If somebody was fleeing, he would sneak them in the back. Um, a lot of times it was who's in your circle rather than reaching out, and going beyond that circle. But those are the people that are really risking their lives, obviously. And I think it's probably a combination. You have to be able to stand the pressure and the danger. Um, and I think you also have to be of a certain age. At my age now, I'm much less likely to join a resistance movement because it's hard for me just to get up off the chair. I can
I'm sure.
cheer.
I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure you're
I
very capable of joining a resistance movement.
should have seen me this morning. I had a very long flight the other day. But I think that has a lot to do with it. Maurice, we don't have proof of this, but I am quite sure that he was working the black market. And that was one of the reasons that the family did so well, uh, and were able to escape and flee. Uh, you know that you know it's also probably why Charles got arrested because he was smuggling. But there is there are a lot of multiple ways that people did resist. I guess that's what I'm saying. And some people were blowing up tracks, and some people were just running a printing press and making IDs. And all of those ways are valid. But I think it's probably a combination of things. Yeah.
So we're drawing to a close, unfortunately. But I wanted to throw this at you finally. I spent most of my adult life writing about World War II, etc. And if you look at human history, you can draw some conclusions, and that is that human history has been defined by beautiful progress and amazing achievements, but it's also been often, perhaps more often than not, been defined by conflict and war. And one of the lessons I think that we should draw from World War II when we look at the Holocaust in particular is that the Holocaust was ended by young people from the Soviet Union, young working class Americans fighting,
Yeah.
fighting and putting everything on the line and defeating fascism and genocidal forces. And so, if we are to remain capable of defeating evil, we must have warriors and we must have a strong military. Democracy needs to be utterly protected. And to do that, as many veterans have told me, you need to have a constantly strong, capable, reactive military. How do you react to that? Do you think that's one of the lessons of World War II?
Um, I'm not sure about that, but what I can say is one of the things that I find most disturbing is when I run into Holocaust deniers, and and they are coming from a place of they aren't acknowledging that by denying the Holocaust, they are also denying the truth that our troops witnessed, that the troops that freed Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and the Russian troops that freed Auschwitz, that, those horrendous Sobibor, all those witnesses are British and American troops, the Allied forces. And and to deny the Holocaust is to deny the sacrifices of our armed forces. And 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 people who aren't concerned about fascism are also denying the sacrifice of our armed forces in World War II. I love what Jimmy Carter says, that war is a necessary evil. Um, and uh, and I am a pacifist. I believe in peace. Um, and but if you have to defend humanity, justice, freedom, democracy, um, then you do need our brave warriors to do that. My concern, and actually I've been talking to people at West Point and somebody else in Georgia about education, is that our armed forces also need to be educated, and so that they have awareness and sensitivity and to ethical and moral behavior. You're not just given a gun, because then you end up with abuse, and we certainly have seen that happen as well. And and I'm not aware. I'm sure it happens, but I'm not aware of that kind of abuse happening during World War II. The young men that went to war, and they were men, of course, at that point, they really understood what was at stake, and 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 were so young and courageous to help preserve democracy and to save Europe. And I think they understood that very, very deeply. And I think we need to understand that today as well.
Well, part of our mission is to make sure that future generations learn the lessons of World War II. And you're a perfect example of someone who's teaching not just the young, but everybody else about humanity, about the importance of education in terms of producing proud citizens and people who are prepared to defend democracy and human rights. So I want to thank you on behalf of Friends for
So
your time.
thank you, everybody. And please join us at 999themovie.com, and you can keep in touch about the film. We are doing festivals right now, and we'll be streaming soon.
Thank you.